every now and again you're given a lesson that you just are excited to teach. And I'm really, really excited about this morning's lesson. I'm excited for several reasons. I guess one of the first ones is just obviously the implications that it has for our lives. I'm excited about it because we got Bible school coming up, and I think this lesson just is you couldn't ask for a better lead-in lesson to Bible school than what we're talking about this morning. I'm excited about it because it's about agriculture. I mean, I love agriculture. I mean, you know, that's just something that's so dear to me in my life and what me and my family do, and to be able to teach a lesson where Jesus gives a parable about agriculture is a lot of fun. And so lots of reasons I'm excited about our lesson this morning. And so having said all that, we'll go ahead and get right into our lesson. The title of our lesson is To Trust God to Work. And the point of our lesson is share Christ in all situations. And then the point says, but leave the results to God. And the first thing I do when I start studying my lesson, I always read what the point is, right? Because, I mean, that just doesn't make sense. And I've been just stumbling over that. Because I think it should say, share Christ in all situations and leave the results to God instead of but leave the results to God. Me personally, I think that's what the point of our lesson should be. So I'm changing it. The point of our lesson this morning is share Christ in all situations and leave the results to God. And so that's what we're going to be talking about. Our verses this morning is a parable that Jesus gave and taught. It's one that there's no one in here, I dare say, that hasn't heard this parable, hasn't pondered on this parable, hasn't heard lessons and sermons preached on this parable. And so it's just going to be very, very familiar. But it's the parable of the sower. And, I'm going to throw out a doozy to us right here. Because what I want to do first is I'm going to read these verses. And I debated about doing something, and then I changed my mind actually on my way to church. But I want to read these verses, and then we're going to have just a discussion on what sticks out. So as I read the verses, as you read along with me at home, guys, if anybody's watching, we just appreciate you being here and so thankful. And but I encourage you to read along with the verses, to look at them on your phone if you don't have a Bible with you, to Google. But we're on Matthew chapter 13, and we're in verses 3 through 8. And so Matthew chapter 13, verses 3 through 8. And again, it's the parable of the sower. And verse 3 says, Matthew 13, verse 3 says, and he spake many things unto them in parables, saying, behold, a sower went forth to sow. And when he sowed, some seeds fell by the wayside, and the fowls came and devoured them up. Some fell upon stony places where they had not much earth, and forthwith they sprung up, because they had no deepness of earth. And when the sun was up, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. And some fell among thorns, and the thorns sprung up and choked them. But others fell into good ground and brought forth fruit, some 100-fold, some 60-fold, and some 30-fold. How many of us have heard this parable before? We've all heard this, right? My question for us this morning is, as you read these verses, and guys, if you follow on with the rest of the verses for this morning, it's just Jesus explaining each of the types of situations that the seed fall into. And that's our lesson this morning. So really, verses 3 through 8 is our lesson. But when you read these verses, when you hear these verses, what does your mind go towards? I know I've thought about this all weekend and y'all haven't. But when you hear the parable of the sower, where does your mind take you? What do you think about?
think I want to be the good ground.
You want to be the good ground. Great point, April.
And there's all sorts of grounds out there.
There's all sorts of grounds out there. That's very good, John. I wasn't the only one that thought this way. So y'all are. Anybody else?
Some of the seeds got ate up by the foul of that air.
That's right. And then they fell on the wayside. It says on the path. And the birds and eat them up. That's exactly right.
Well, there's one point, Jason, is that no matter how good a farmer or agriculturist you are, you could do everything just right. You could get analysis of your land, and figure out what you're going to grow and what you need to do to prepare the ground with particular fertilizer or whatever to grow what you want to grow. But no matter how good you are and how well you prepare the soil and how careful you are planting the seed, only God can make it grow. You've done all your part that you can do, but it's still up to Him whether it grows or not.
And Mike, you're looking at it on a completely different side of this, and I love that opinion. I think that's right. Anybody else?
Our part is the effort. God's part is the results or the outcome.
And you're tying on with what Mike said. I mean, that's exactly right.
But although it fell on good soil, look at the difference amounts of fruit that was produced because of it. That kind of goes along with that.
Okay, now Janet, I'm going to lump you with Bonnie and Johnny and April. You're exactly right. The good soil, what fell on the good soil, the results were just astounding.
But you can tie them together too, and that what we do toward other people, casting God's word on them, they have to accept it, and it's God that actually does the saving, the producing. They have to accept that.
So April, I'm lumping you with Mike and Mike.
The seeds can be right beside each other, kind of like the person right beside of you can be lost and you not know it. You might be on the good ground, and the bad ground is right next to it, just a row over, but you don't really realize it.
What a great point, Heather. And I think that's exactly right. And guys, I'll just in lieu of, I'd love to keep going. But when I read these verses, and I've heard this parable my whole life, and every time I've heard the parable, and every time I've read the verses, and on this week as I started preparing for my lesson, my mind is with Bonnie and Johnny. I go to what the results are in April. I go to what the results are of the seeds that were sown. That's where I went just as soon as I read that parable. I go to, okay, the results of the seed falling in the wayside was what? They didn't grow and the birds ate them. And then I go to the results of the seed that fell on the rocky ground. And what were the results of that? The seed germinates, and it says it germinates quickly. Did you catch that? It says it germinates quickly. But then it doesn't develop any roots because the ground is rocky and they can't go down very far. So when the sun comes up and hits it, what happens to it? It withers and dies. And then I focus on the results of the seed that fell in the thorns, and how that the thorns clog them up and choke out. The seed starts to grow, but then the thorns choke it out. And then I focus on the results of the seed that fell in the fertile ground, and how the results were just tremendous. That's where my mind goes just as soon as I read this parable. I mean, that's exactly what I got to thinking. But you know what? Some of y'all had a different opinion. Mike, April, and Heather, that the seed falls and the results ain't up to us. The results are up to God. And as we go, that's going to be the whole issue of our whole lesson this morning. Because what I want to challenge us and what I want us to look at is in verse 3, we see what Jesus' parable is about. The parable is about who? If we see it right in verse 3. The sower. That's right. The parable isn't about the results. The parable is about the sower. And so it says, and he spake many things unto them in parables, saying, Behold, a sower went forth to sow. The parable is about the sower. And the sower that went forth to sow. And it says in verse 4, And when he sowed, some seeds fell by the waysides, and the fowls came up and devoured them. Some fell upon the stony places where they had not much earth, and forthwith they sprung up because they had no deepness of earth. And when the sun was up, they were scorched, and because they had no roots, they withered away. And some fell among thorns, and the thorns sprung up and choked them. But others fell into good ground and brought forth fruit, some 100-fold, some 60-fold, some 30-fold. I want to start in verse 7. We're going to work backwards. Just makes a little more sense to me right here. I'm skipping verse 8. And we're going to just get into agriculture right now. That's all we're going to talk about. You know, I read these verses myself, and like I said, my mind goes to results. And so, as a farmer, I read verse 7, and I see the results of the seeds falling in amongst the thorns, and what do I think needs to happen? Get them dang thorns out. There's no sense in me taking the time and sowing seed into a place where they're not going to do good. So I'm going to do everything in my power to remove the obstacles from letting that plant be successful. Is that a common way to think? I mean,
Don't stick your hand down there, you'll get thorn.
you liable to, for sure. I've spent several hours last Sunday in Felicia's flower bed, and there's still thorns in there that ain't festered and where I can mash them out yet. But you're exactly right, Lily.
But then some farmers would think, why deal with those thorns? Just go to the better ground.
Thank you. Bonnie, you're exactly right. And you're just going to tie, all this is going to tie together. Guys, I've got it all in my mind how I want it to go, and I know it's not all going to come out. Because, like I said, I feel real confident about the agriculture part of this and tying it in. So I'm sure I'm going to miss stuff, but you're exactly right, Bonnie. That's exactly right. You know, some farmers would think, let's go to, I'm not going to waste the time on this ground. I'm going to go to where there's good ground, and I'm going to spend my time in that good ground.
Some don't have that option.
But you
They
don't
gotta
always
work what
know,
they've got.
you don't always know which ground's good ground.
Ain't that the truth there, John?
I've seen wild rose bushes take over like hay field, and you just have to plow it out and start over. You have to make the ground good. I've seen that where
You're
it just
exactly
goes
right.
nuts.
And that's what we think as a farmer, as a gardener. That's how we think, right? Let's remove the thorns. That way that plant has good soil. Guys, what I want us to realize, as I said, this parable is about who? The sower. If you're spending time getting thorns out of the ground, what are you not spending time doing?
So,
That's the whole point of this lesson this morning. I probably could sit down right now and be done. Because that's what we get so wrapped up in. Just like Bonnie said, just like we get wrapped up in putting seed in good ground that we get wrapped up in, and Michael said, getting the rose bushes out. We get so wrapped up in that we spend time preparing the ground. We spend time removing the thorns. And all that time we spent doing that, what are we not doing? We're not sowing. And that's why it hit me this on Wednesday night as I was reading my lesson. Wait a minute, this ain't about preparing ground. This parable wasn't about all the work that took to get the ground ready. This parable was about sowing the seed and being the sower I'm going to get into another, we're going to go back. I told you I was going to work backwards, but I want to touch base on something else. You know, when you buy a bag of seed, if you buy a bag of Kentucky 31, there's a tag on that bag. Has anybody ever paid any attention? It's usually sewed in. What does that tag say?
Talks about this other stuff that's in the bag.
Talks about the other stuff's in the bag. That's one thing it says. Germination rate. Exactly right, Nathan. It tells you what percent of the seed will germinate.
How much of it is weeds?
How much of it is weeds and other material in that bag of seed. That's exactly right. If you pick up a bag of Kentucky 31 and they got it on sale and the germination's 50%, are you going to buy that bag of seed that's germination's 50%, or are you going to buy the one that's 96%? I mean, I'm just asking a question. What do y'all think?
So the good seed.
You're going to sow the good seed. Guys, the other thing that hit me...
Some people might buy the bag on sale.
Look, Marty, you're right. Some people... I seen Franklin nodding and he was looking at me. You just go over the field 4 times instead of once. You're exactly right, Marty. But you realize, guys, the reason I brought this up, the seed that we are asked to sow is the best seed that's ever been. It's the most pure seed. It's the most powerful seed. It's the most excellent seed. Most productive. It's perfect seed is what we're asked to sow. There's a couple points to this I want to bring up. If we read this parable, does it say that the sower is supposed to sow the 50% seed on the rocks and the wayside and in the thorns? It ain't broke up, is it? Huh. That's telling, right? The same seed that's thrown on the fertile ground is thrown in the thorns, in the rocks, in the wayside. We got Bible school coming up. I'm just telling you what human nature is. We got that kid that comes in and he acts good. He's respectful and he listens. And he's attentive. And as a group leader, as the leader of the Bible Adventures, you spend your time with which kid? That kid or the kid that comes in and he ain't stopped since he got here. And his hair's a mess and his clothes are a mess and they're running crazy and somebody's just constantly getting him and sitting him down, getting him and sitting him down, getting him and spitting him down. You see my point? You see where I'm going with this? We're called to be the sowers, and we're sowing the best seed all the time, without regard to where that seed is going to fall. My challenge to me, my challenge to you, as we look at this lesson, as we continue on, as we got Bible school coming up, my challenge is to make sure that we're realizing that we're sowing the absolute best seed and that we continue sowing it no matter where it falls, because that's exactly what this parable is about. Jesus doesn't say, go and prepare the perfect soil and then throw the best seed on it. Because that's what we want to do. Talking strictly agriculturally, let's sow the best seed in the best soil so we take time to prepare it and take time to nurture it. But that ain't what Jesus says. You know, Felicia and I, she looked up, we was talking about this on Friday and she Googled it, something on one of her apps, her devotion apps. And in that app, it talked about this idea of sometimes we try to read into things too much. Especially Jesus' parables. We try to get this grand meaning, and just like I said, we get to focusing on the results of the work that we did and preparing the soil. But you know, all Jesus said was the sower was supposed to do what? It starts out, it says a sower went forth to do what? Sow. That's the whole parable. That's the whole parable. My challenge, guys, my challenge is to sow. We go back to the thorns. and we say, okay, we're going to take the thorns out of the equation. What does, if we look on in verse 22, just jumping ahead, it says, he also that receiveth seed among the thorns is he that heareth the word, and the care of this world, and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and he becometh unfruitful. And Jesus is saying the thorns are the things of this world. And so we spend so much time fighting against the things of this world. We spend so much time legislating things out of this world, trying to. Is that an accurate statement? As Christians, we get caught up in things being legislated out, and we're going to argue and we're going to fight. And if we can just remove these thorns from the world, then that seed will be fruitful. But like I said before, all that time we're spending trying to remove these thorns of this world is times that we're not doing what? We're not sowing. Guys, I can't say it any different than that. I don't know how else you interpret what Jesus is telling us other than that. I'm not saying that working on legislation, I'm not saying that going to your home and making sure that, you know, your computers are safe and the kids can see what, I'm not saying any of that. But what I'm saying is if when we concentrate our time and our effort on trying to remove the thorns of this world, you know, another discussion that Felicia and I had and that me and Libby had on Wednesday night. Libby, I love Libby to death. Libby said something. She said, you know, the kids of this world today, they've got it so much harder than we did. And I said, yeah. I don't believe that. Because Solomon said there's nothing new under the sun. The same thorns that were in the world when Jesus wrote this parable, those same thorns are in this world today. They're not in this, not the same context. They're not the same ways to get into it. But the same thorns were there then that are here now. And Jesus knew that. But yet he said, you sow, and you spend your time sowing, knowing that you're doing what you're supposed to do, sowing, instead of spending all of your time trying to remove the thorns. Some of you may not agree with me.
Well, the important thing is to sow, to leave the results up to the Lord.
Exactly right, Mike. Exactly right.
This is like one of my, I guess it is my favorite parable in the Bible, but I just hope that, because I've not sit down with a lot of people and like actually seen them saved. So, you know, in the back of my mind, I'm like, am I doing something wrong? Mm-hmm. But like this parable is kind of what I lean on, and that, you know, hopefully one day there will have been a lot of seeds sown through the, you know, every group of people you're in. I mean, and we're all in a lot of different groups of people, I'm sure. And, you know, that seed planted by April, Jason can come by and water it and she'll never know it. But, you know, sowing it to begin with is huge. But you may never see the results until you're, you know,
not hearing it. That's exactly right.
A lot of times you're sowing seed and you don't even realize it.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, I like the focusing on that. The beginning of the verse, a sower went to sow. A sower's job is to sow. It's not really doing anything different. The goal of Christianity is to make yourself into the type of person who is a sower of good seed. So it's not that you're going around doing something specifically different from what you always do. It's just you're going around and being yourself. And that is sowing good seed.
Huh. What a great point, Franklin. What a great point.
Franklin, when I was in college, things weren't very different than they are now. Well, maybe worse, because there were a lot of drugs. And anyway, I was in college with a lot of just really worldly girls, and I used to work pretty hard in my school lessons, and then I would get up on my bunk bed and I'd just read the Word, not because I had to, but just because I really wanted to. And so it got around that I was a Christian, you know, and I didn't say anything to anybody about it. But all I did was I spent time with the girls. I would go to somebody's room and just hang out with them and talk with them and really listen. And eventually they would tell me about big horrible things in their lives. Boyfriend beating them, drug abuse, all kinds of things that go on. And I would just say, I'm going to be praying for you. And then I would come back the next day and ask how it was going. And come back a few days later, how's it going with that? And let them know I really cared. And one by one, they started saying to me, give me what you have. I want to know God the way you do. And 15 girls on my hall came to Christ.
Amen.
And I didn't knock on anybody's door and say, can I tell you about Jesus? All I did was I hung out with them. And I hung out with people that maybe nobody else liked. I just hung out with every one of them. And I loved every one of them. That's all I did.
That's so cool. And that's, I mean, what an example of just so, we make it real hard.
That plays it right into what you were saying. You weren't tied up in removing the thorns. You know, you're a good teacher, coach, leader. It's just giving them the tools, or like you said, just being there and show them the way. I don't know how you want to say it, but it's not necessarily. It's no different than raising kids, and you try to take all the, all the thorns away. You can't do it. I mean, you gotta let them. Experience it just like we did. But they'll say it don't pay off.
That's great.
You gotta show you care.
That's a great point, guys. What a great example. But it's exactly right.
Jason, when I was a young man growing up, and I think some of the older ones here will agree with me, you could drive down the road and the fields, the farms, they were in better shape than they are now. You look at the fields, you look at them, and there's a lot of blackberry briar growing, and there's a lot of that sort of thing. Farmers take care of their land, and that's you can notice those places. But when I was growing up, the majority of places look like that. And now there's a lot more thorns, there's a lot more briars, there's a lot more grown-up places out when you start driving around. And I think the difference in yesterday and today for young people, and you mentioned that a minute ago, is there are more thorns. There are more of that type of. We've left off caring for the soul, the hearts of those young people, and there's more thorns there to get in the way.
Well, I don't know that I agree with you, honey. I love you, and I understand. But
the Bible tells us the further the time goes, the harder the time goes.
certainly,
It's destiny.
I agree for sure, but I think it's very important that we, and I think what this parable says, and I think what we lose sight of so often, is that we think we've got to have the field exactly right before we can sow the seed. I mean, and we spend a lot of time trying to make the field exactly right. That is time that we could be spent sowing, that we spend preparing. And I'm not arguing with you, Lonnie. I just don't. I don't necessarily. I mean, I just don't.
Maybe the middle ground is there's not as many sowers out there.
And I thought, what a great point of that, Marty. I mean, maybe so. I mean, and that when you look at it and you use the field example, I got another kind of example that. So, in the Christmas trees, all we've ever sprayed is Roundup for weed control, ever. Till the last couple of years, we've started trying to use some stinger. But, you've got weeds now that Roundup don't kill. Horseweed and lamb's quarter and velvet leaf. Roundup just does not faze it. And so several years ago, I'd get so caught up that I was going through and I was trying to find different products that would work, or I'd be out there weed eating in July and August, trying to take care of these weeds that Roundup wasn't controlling. And I ought to have been sure. Because July and August, but I spent time trying to control the weeds instead of sharing. And what I got to realizing was that, them weeds look terrible, but in January and February, they all die. And I'm sitting there with a tree, and it's perfectly healthy. And it's fine. And, those weeds have dried and fell over. And I guess I say that as an example is that like 3 years ago, I said, look, I ain't going to worry about them dang weeds that Roundup won't control anymore. I'm going to start shearing in July. And everything's been fine. And I use that, again, as this idea that we think we've got to remove all the thorns, but there's more important things that need to be happening than removing those thorns. And to our example this morning is the idea of the sowing. Lonnie, I don't disagree that there are thorns out there. I just don't believe in my heart that there's more thorns now than when me and Marty were growing up, or that when me and you were growing up. I believe the thorns are different, but I don't believe that there's any more.
People are counting on or looking at the thorns and producing them instead of the Word of God. Now the parable is this: is the seed is the Word of God in Luke 8:11. So if they're not concentrating on the Word, they're not producing fruit there.
That's exactly right.
I think maybe rather than there's more thorns, there's less leadership on how to recognize where you need to stay and focus versus getting distracted and focusing on the thorns.
Well, it goes, Heather, and it goes right back to what Lonnie said. I mean, what Marty said is there's less sowers. So if there's less sowers, then there's less people out there that are focusing on that. And I think that's a valid point too.
When I was growing up, I can remember when gas stations and restaurants were not open on Sunday. Families went to church, went home, they had a family lunch, they visited their neighbors or family. We always went to my grandpa Tucker's, or he came to our house on Sunday afternoons. And people just don't do that, and I think that strengthens the family, and it strengthens the sowers. And now we don't have that. Look at the drive-thrus. Look at the and I'm guilty of it too.
Well, we all. It's for sure.
Nobody sits down at the same time to eat and has I know there's families that attempt that, and that that is great that they do that, and hopefully, I think if we got back to more of spending family time and growing, showing our kids the importance of that, then we'd have more sowers.
I agree with that.
My point really had to do with and I'm not arguing with you. These souls represent people's hearts, and there is no way we cannot see that there's less good soul today when you think of it in terms of heart, and there's more with thorns. There's more people who are thinking of other things other than being in church and worshiping God than there ever have been.
Well, I think that's for sure. That's a
it points
proven
out
fact.
we've got to have more sowers. Yes, we do. But looking at the condition of the hearts, that there's less good soul. So that thorny issue is one to deal with for sure.
And guys, let's getting back into the verses. We can talk about I can use the same examples that we've already used about the seeds that fall on the rocks, and that we can spend time preparing. We can take a subsoiler and run it through rocky ground and hard ground and try to break it up to make it better for the seeds so their roots can get down instead of withering on the rocks. But again, the point of that is that we're spending time doing something instead of sowing. I mean, it goes back. But then I look at the first example, and this just something that just hits me so hard is the seed that fell on the wayside. You know, and if you look at what Jesus meant by the wayside, it's just the path that you use to walk to the field. You know, we all know what a field path, you know, I call them field roads. But, you know, when the sower was sowing, some of those seeds fell on that field road. And that, you know, obviously never had a chance, we think. And the birds came and eat them up. I think it's one point of that is that the bird ate that perfect seed. It got devoured. The farmer threw that perfect seed onto the road, knowing that the sower did, knowing that it probably wouldn't come up. But you know, how many of us have ever seen that blade of grass coming through a slab of asphalt? Think about that. I mean, as I thought about that verse, as I thought about this thought, you know, or a dandelion, but you know, you get that. We resurface a road, and I'm spending $130,000 a mile to resurface a road with asphalt. And the contractor gets done, and they pull out, and 3 weeks later, I'm driving down that road, and there's a dang blade of grass coming up through that $130,000 a mile asphalt that's just been put. And as I thought about that, I think about what verse 4 says.
And that ain't just one layer.
No, I mean, that's right.
Yeah, I mean, how deep is that?
Some of them roads is a lot of asphalt. But you know.
But the power that blade of grass can have, too. You can break through.
Like my yard, Jason, every time I mow it, dandelions just come up that much faster.
they sure do, don't they, Lily?
They said on the radio, said not to cut them too far down, because if you think they need them, they were good for you.
But just like out here in our parking lot, we've seen the same thing happen, and strength in numbers too, when more and more come.
Exactly.
If the root is good, the fruit is good. So Jesus is the root, and we're supposed to be the fruit.
That's right. And you know, but to all of y'all's points, think about the power of that blade of grass. Just like that one blade of grass can lift up.
Yeah, it can and get higher. That's what it is on our apartment. They mowed it. But now it's going to have to be mowed again. It's getting like a haystack now.
Exactly right. But you know, when you think about this idea of that farmer, and in my mind, as I told you, as I started preparing for this lesson, I read that verses and I think, you know what that farmer did? I mean, I'm just being as honest as I can. As a farmer, that sower shouldn't have thrown no dang grass on the wayside. I think about myself, okay, we're planting Christmas trees, and the way we do it, we ain't used a tractor in several years. We plant everything by hand. Kathleen drops the plants, and me and the boys plant them. 4,500, 5,000 plants. Kathleen drops each one, and me and the boys go behind and plant them. So I get to the edge of the field. There where the trees were the first crop, and the deer always eat them. Or they was in the shade right there a little bit, and they was number twos from the get-go. And Kathleen drops that real good plant right there on the edge of the field, and I go through planting, I'll grab that real good plant, and I'll go over here to the middle of the field and grab a little dinky plant, and I'll switch it. Has anybody else done that? Same thing if you go to Lowe's and they got something on sale, and you kind of think, I really don't know if I want that or not, but yeah, I might buy it, and you go put it in the shade somewhere where nothing else has ever grown. We're guilty, right? I mean, we do that. And in my mind, it goes back to this same idea of why would the sower, as I read this, what comes out in my mind the first time, why would he even throw anything right there on next to the road? Just in order to know it ain't going to come up. And it's perfect seed. It ain't like he used half-price seed. He threw the real deal. And then all I could think about was that blade of grass coming through the asphalt. and how much power that blade of grass has that comes to that. And again, it goes back to, like I said, for Bible school and for not just Bible school, but for our lives, realizing we just sow. We just sow, and we don't worry where it lands. We don't worry if it lands in the thorns or on the wayside or on the rocks. If we'll just sow and spend our time sowing. Any more discussion before I'm about wrapped up?
Jason, Wayne and I studied this verse a couple months ago, and we learned that in Bible times, it wasn't so important where you sowed. They didn't do a lot of soil prep. What mattered was when they sowed. They had to sow right before the rainy season, because that's the only time there would be rain to water the seeds and water the crop. And when I think of that, in the Bible, rain is often a representative of the Holy Spirit. We must be praying for Bible school. It's really important that those seeds are watered and by prayer. Don't you think?
Oh, I do, and I think what a great point. I mean, what a very, very great point. A lot of times I think that's something that's really worth talking about. We're talking about the sower and not being worried about it and just sowing. But if we're just sowing and we're not praying for the seeds that we sown, then we may be setting the seed up for failure from the get-go. I mean, I think that's a great point. I really do. Guys, just as a close, and I'm not saying we won't discuss anymore, but as a farmer, my only experience with sowing seed is our food plots for the deer, right? And I think a lot of y'all know us. I mean, when we go to do something, it ain't like we had time to do it to start with. It's at midnight with a headlamp, and so I know it's getting close to Labor Day, and we've sprayed our food plots in August with Roundup, and we did that with a headlamp for 3 minutes when we had a minute, and then you went through there and tried to run a disc over the time or two, and then you're out there. So you ain't got to. Every year I think I'm going to prepare the soil better for my food plots, but it don't never happen. So what do I do to compensate for my lack of soil preparation?
More seed.
That's exactly right, Johnny. Them oats, them buck forage oats that we plant, the seeding rate for oats is a bushel an acre, right? So what do I plant? 2 bushels an acre. That's how I compensate for lack of soil preparation. Y'all get where I'm coming from, right? Can we do the same thing? Not worry about the soil preparation, not worry about the thorns and the rocks and the wayside. Just sow more seed. Just sow more of this absolutely perfect seed. Lonnie, I kind of set you up. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I knew I was.
My sermon.
I'm gonna sit in the back.
It's coming.
Yeah. I'm not saying I think you was exactly right what you said. But I also think that the solution is that we double the rate of seed that we're sowing to compensate for the world and the times that we're living in now. Can we do that? I mean, what does that actually mean in regards to sowing the seed of Christ? To double the rate. I mean, that we just, everywhere we go. For me to sow double the amount of seed on the food plot, I've got to get, instead of 1 bag, I'm dumping 2 bags into the spreader. And can we look at our lives? Can we look at the next week with Bible school coming up, that, I'm going to double the rate of seed that I sowed. I'm going to go above and beyond my role as a sower. And I want to leave us with that thought. If does anybody have any discussion before we close? Yes, Wayne.
Be the message. Live the message. And share the message as many ways as you can. And leave the harvest up to God.
Amen.
After April had been at the University of Maryland, I came up from my college to visit her, and I asked one of the students carrying books somewhere, I said, what was the name of the dorm? I think it was Stevenson. I said, where is Stevenson? And they said, over there. And why are you going there? And I said, well, my girlfriend, my going to be fiance, lives there on the 7th floor. And this other student said, you mean 7th heaven? You don't want to go there. There are no drugs. There are no wild girls. You're going to 7th heaven? Are you crazy? They're all Christians. That's the honest truth.
Amen.
That's exactly what happened.
And guys, what a great example. And going back to Marty's point and the thing that he said, that, you know, as we close this morning, the point of the lesson is share Christ in all situations and leave the results to God. And we're to sow. That's all we're asked to do, is to be the sower. And we leave the results to Him. I mean, April brought up the point of prayer and praying for the seed that we sowed. But ultimately, if we ain't sowed no seed, praying for the seeds we sowed ain't doing no good, is it? You know, to use April's point as an example, if we're thinking about sowing and we never sowed any and it rains, is that seed going to germinate? No, I don't think so. And so we sow the seed, we pray for those seeds we sowed, and we leave the results to God. Don't get tied down. Don't get burdened and making sure everything is right. Because that isn't the example we were given. The example we were given was just to sow. Guys, any more discussion before we close? No, thank y'all.